Lisa, thank you for having us. It's great to be here. Thank you for encouraging me to wake up so early on a Saturday morning and look like a human being. It's a great joy to be here, especially with my great friend and colleague, Suzanne Smeaton. We have worked on several projects together. Suzanne was very kind enough to do an extremely important essay for an exhibition that I did some years ago, and I've forever been in her debt. So I can't think of anything more fun than sitting here with her today.
Life's Pleasures, the title of the
it was Life's Pleasures, the Ash Can, and Artist Brush with Leisure.
Yes. So I spoke about frames, wrote about Frames of the Ash Can painters.
Yes, yeah. Which was that was a great essay, actually. Anyway, on to Stettheimer. Nancy couldn't be here. She has a issue that she couldn't fly, in any case. So she asked me to sit in and sort of give you her thoughts, along with Zan's, on Florine Stettheimer and how she came about meeting Florine Stettheimer, if you would. I had the privilege of working with Nancy Shaw for nearly 2 decades. And during that period, at the Detroit Institute of Arts, which has one of the greatest collections in the world and was a great institution, Nancy joined the staff of the DIA at a very young age in 1970-71. At which time she found the American collection a very different place. It had been recently reinstalled. The North Wing had been added to the building, and the American Wing grew to encompass what were the old special exhibition galleries in the center of what is the American Wing. So it increased to about 11,000 square feet. The initial installation that went in there really had a lot of focus on 18th century and 18th century decorative arts. Not necessarily the greatest strength of the DIA. There's some spectacular pieces. So the center core was filled with 18th century furniture, and there was an enormous amount of, shall we say, real estate devoted to the 18th century portrait. Nancy gets there, and there is so much that we think about today in American art that's in storage. Much of the Ash Can's in storage. The American Impressionists are in storage. And many of, if not all, the women painters, including Cassatt, as well as Florine Stettheimer. So as she's going through storage, she begins to discover these artists, and she's thinking they're just incredibly wonderful. So in 1972-3, she does an exhibition of American women artists.
I just need to interject that
Yes.
Nancy shared with me that she was speaking with her superiors about female artists and having them on view, and his comment at the time was that the greatest contribution that Mary Cassatt had made to American art was to actually advise her friends to buy the French Impressionists. That's sort of the view in the early 70s.
Opinions were a little askew. And so Nancy does this exhibition, and she unearths the painting we have on the screen right now.
In its original frame, I might add.
Called Love Flight of the Pink Candy Heart. And actually, an outgrowth of this exhibition that she does, her first acquisition. Her second acquisition, by the way, was buying Coat Epoxy by Frederick Church. But her first acquisition was to buy Medusa by Harriet Hosmer. So introducing a female sculptor into the collection. So this was a really big, groundbreaking thing. Well, after Nancy's exhibition, she discovers Love Flight of the Pink Candy Heart. All of a sudden, all of this great painting that we all think of today that is part of the canon, and wasn't at the time, starts to creep into the galleries. And that is when she falls in love with Florine Stettheimer and begins to just really dig into who this artist was. And as such, Stettheimer, she begins to figure out that, she wasn't really widely exhibited. Many museums had her, but at that time, so many were in storage. She even talks about a story. She actually knew Andy Warhol, and Nancy talks about Nancy knew Andy Warhol, and she talks about Warhol having to get special permission to go to the Met to see the Stettheimer canvases.
Yes, because the Met, and we'll touch on the Cathedral series, but
Yeah.
the Met actually has all 4 of the Cathedral series paintings, but for many years, as was the case of many museums across the country, had Stettheimer paintings in their collection that were not on view.
So I remember the first time I saw Love Flight of the Pink Candy Heart, and I became mesmerized with this painting. In my sort of later teens, I discovered that going to museums was a great dating tool. And so I began to go to them a lot. It was an effective device. And I remember walking into the galleries of the American Wing, which, believe me, at this point was not really on my radar so much. And in what I would later know to be Ashcan painting, hanging is the Love Flight of the Pink Candy Heart. So think about Sloane and Bellows and Henry, and then Stettheimer. So here she is introduced. Well, many years later, I begin to work with Nancy, and we talk about this painting a great deal, which for one reason or another had been transferred into the modern and contemporary department, where our colleagues in that department were not too keen on Stettheimer or a lot of the American figural painters of the 20s and 30s. And so they come out at times, but many times they were also hidden because, let's face it, they had to show, Kelly or Newman or somebody like that. That was just more of what they were interested in.
Well, and Stettheimer actually is such an extraordinary character. I'm just going to advance. Florine Stettheimer was born in 1871 in Rochester, New York, to a wealthy German Jewish family. And the father deserted the family very early on, and the mother proceeded to raise the children. There was an older brother and sister who ended up marrying and moving out to California, and that left the mother and the 3 single daughters, Carrie, Florine, and Eddie, Henrietta. And actually, they traveled extensively. They led an incredibly cosmopolitan life. They went over and spent years living in Europe, primarily in Germany, but traveling to France and Italy, going to ballet, going to museums. Florine took painting lessons. They came back to New York in the 1890s. She studied at the Art Students League. They went back and forth to Europe and didn't come back to the US until 1914. And it's interesting to remember that at that time, Florine is 44 years old, not a young lady.
And I think this age aspect is very important as we discuss Florine, because in thinking about Florine and looking at her work and thinking about the Love Flight of the Pink Candy Heart, we always think of Florine as this very young, energetic, ingenue, and it's really the image that she conveys for herself.
Throughout her career, she's perpetually young, as are her sisters.
Sort of a Dorian Gray type of thing, in reverse, actually. But when we look at this early work of hers, and when we say early, as Ann just mentioned, she's in her 40s when she paints this. This is her mother, and it's a self-portrait with her 2 sisters. I want you to look at this painting, and if you think about it, how different is it from illustrations that we have seen of Henry or Sloane doing the little groups where they're talking? Sort of the interaction. There's the famous drawing of the Sloanes and the Henrys together. This is very much in that same line. Really what we are going to see with Stettheimer is she paints what she knows. She paints the life around her. And that becomes her core, if you would, subject matter for the majority of her work. And when we see this, and this is really, World War I is just beginning, and that's going to have a big impact, because if she's still painting in this more traditional style, you might say, but we're about to see her change, and change radically about 1916, where her palette becomes just out of this world. It's a unique palette. Subject matter really stays the same, but she begins to interpret people almost in a fantasy way, the way she would like life to be. And I think a lot of this has to do because so many of the artists were just devastated by the carnage of World War I. If you think of how Bellows' response was or Sargent's response and how different it is from their work, Stettheimer changes and she begins to paint, as we're going to see now, with how she thinks the world should be. She makes it a very pretty place. And
Sorry.
here you see with the studio party, and Zahn and I have talked about these a great deal. They're fun things. That you look at this, they're beautiful. It's a beautiful environment. It is pretty. It is nice. It is not the gritty world that you walk around in every day. Florine is giving us an escape. And you have the best line with this painting.
Whoa. I'm not sure which line you're referring to, but one of the things that I think is so interesting about Florine, whenever she completed a canvas, she would have a birthday party for the painting. And this is called soiree or studio party. And on the bottom left are Albert Glez and who else is?
Here's the cheat sheet.
We have a whole crib sheet, yes, here of who's who. Everyone in this painting is a known individual. Her circle is mind-boggling. So it's Gaston Lachaise and Albert Glez looking at the new painting. Back behind them is Eddie, sitting there on the left.
Her younger sister.
Yes, her younger sister next to Isabelle Lachaise. Behind them is Maurice Stern. In the center, in the yellow suit, is Avery Hopwood, the playwright. The Hindu poet Sankar is seated in the back in front of another Florine Stettheimer painting, The Reclining Nude, which is purported to be Florine, an actual self-portrait, and that could be an entire talk in itself, that particular painting. In the blue suit in the center is Leo Stein. On the right, on the couch, is Juliette Glez, then Florine in the center, and the harlequin legs are unknown, but it could potentially be Marcel Duchamp, who was also a really close friend. Their social circle is mind-boggling.
It likely is. She does have a very, very strong affinity for Duchamp, and one of the symbols of him is this harlequin, and we'll talk about that a little bit down the road. The interesting thing is she's painting her life. She's painting this social scene. In many ways, she's creating rotogravure in this magnificent palette, which dominated the social pages at that time.
So you want to speak about her portraits?
Yes, let's talk about it.
Alrighty. Henry McBride.
Indeed, it is a fabulous painting. And Henry McBride was a great critic. Pivotal, he once, in looking at the painting, he was looking at the painting that we just saw, he wrote about it, said he felt offended because he wasn't included. Seemed like
Actually, that was Lafette Duchamp.
That's Lafette Duchamp, right. But he is pivotal in the way in Florine's life, and he will appear in other canvases. But if you look at the way she depicts him, again, he's idealized. This is, we know it's him. In some ways, I hate using the term caricature, but she creates a caricature. She interprets the way she wants to see him, and thus creating this wonderful part of what we might call her rogues gallery, because she does do several portraits throughout her career.
And the interesting thing about her portraits, which you'll see coming up on several of them, is there's the individual, but then she surrounds the image with a number of different scenes that reference aspects of that individual's life and who they are. Another wonderful example, this is Carl Van Vechten. Carl Van Vechten, one of the great supporters, really creators of awareness and the Harlem Renaissance, writer, was very close with the Stettheimer sisters.
And was very famous for his, we should back up a minute and talk about the Stettheimer sisters and their mother had basically a salon. They entertained a great deal of people, which is one of the pivotal roles Florine Stettheimer plays. She's not only a painter, and by that part, and through that avenue, part of the American art world, she's also entertains the American art world, the cultural world, and much in the same way Carl Van Vechten does. You know, there is the famous story of Bessie Smith being in Van Vechten's house, and Bessie Smith and his wife having a little disagreement, but nonetheless. Van Vechten is a part of that same kind of milieu of what's going on. So we're really getting these glimpses of the art and culture world that is New York in the teens, 20s, and 30s. That is what she's giving us.
Yeah.
Again, and really, she's one of the few artists who really does give us this kind of document, if you think about it.
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, how many times when I've looked at these images, I thought, oh, would I love to be a fly on the wall at a Stettheimer salon. Duchamp.
Marcel Duchamp. This is a double portrait of Marcel Duchamp, both as himself and as his alter ego. And Duchamp was, Stettheimer was very, very fond of Duchamp. The exact nature of the relationship we don't know, and I really don't care. I just know that he is a pivotal figure in her life. And again, we have to talk about the age thing here. Duchamp is a very young, debonair artist who Florine wants to cultivate and keep around. And at this point in her life, Florine's now, you know, a little, let's say she's in the 50s at this point.
Right, yeah, they're a good 20 years.
Yeah, a good
difference.
20 years.
And there's some indication that there may have been a romantic relationship actually between Duchamp and Eddie.
Right.
I'm not sure anyone's been able really to document that. And he was a well-known ladies'
He was popular.
man. Yeah, very popular, yeah. And of course, I must call attention to this remarkable frame. And I'll talk about it further in my talk about frames, but what an extraordinary frame, far more excessive than a typical child Hassan frame where he would carve his initials into the corners or into the frame, where here you actually have the initials of the subject of the portrait cut out in small letters circling the frame. La Fête Duchamp.
La Fête Duchamp. And of course, again, now we bring Duchamp into a party. And
This was his 30th birthday party.
And how realistic it is, again, we don't know. It is an imagined scene. But there's all sorts of things going on. And what I like about Stettheimer is she will paint, the way she paints is she includes people at different times in the event in the same canvas. So on the upper left-hand side, you see Duchamp and his date arriving in an automobile, and then they're walking later on in the painting, in the foreground, they're walking through the arch. So
Actually, Picabia.
Yeah.
Duchamp and Picabia arriving in the red convertible.
And then
again in the foreground.
Right. And I think he is depicted again in the painting as well, I believe. But what you see here again is this incredible group of people that is her social circle. The palette, let's talk about the palette. It's these wonderful, bright yellows, intense blues, really sort of not colors you're going to see in nature. And that's pretty darn important because, again, she's taking us into her imagined life, her world.
Yeah, this style of painting is something that Duchamp called multiplication virtuelle, and it was a reference to the fact that it was showing multiple scenes that took place throughout different times of the evening, but showing them all on the canvas. So it was this gathering and cocktails and then a dinner party later on, and that dinner party you see up across the top of the canvas. But first I'd call your attention on the right in the white under the tree is Henrietta, Eddie, and she's reading, and both of those figures are Leo Stein, who is notably hard of hearing, and both of those, he's got his ear trying to hear what she's saying. And then in the center is Carl Van Vechten. There's de Buenavista, who is a Peruvian diplomat, at the table in the back. Florine is towards the back left there, talking to Arnold Glez. Fania Marinov, who was a Russian actress and the wife of Carl Van Vechten, is in that little gazebo canopy affair in the back. And then across the back, on one end on the far left is Duchamp, and on the other end of the table is Eddie proposing a toast towards him. So it's all the people that are depicted here, as well as other dinner guests, and having the dinner in the background at the same time.
And I think Zahn's feeling about the paintings, how she'd like to be a fly on the wall, like she would want to be part of it. I truly believe that's what Stettheimer's trying to do, is seduce us and ask us, wouldn't you like to be part of this? Isn't this fun? Or too bad you weren't there, depending on how
This is the painting that Henry McBride looked at
Yeah.
and talked about it. And when he first saw this painting, he was not really very familiar with Florine Stettheimer yet. And he talks about it, says, I understand all these people are well-known people, and the longer I look at this painting, the more I wish I'd been invited to that party.
Yes. Now, this is an interesting painting because, if I'm not mistaken, it's the only time all four sisters are depicted with the mother. Now, take a good look at this. Notice that the mother sits there very much in charge of her world and in charge of these four young women who, again, are painted as these ingenues, but these ingenues are now well into their 50s. It's called Heat. You see the way they're languishing. Zahn and I have gone back and forth. We think it's outside, but we're not sure because some of the chairs look like it's interior. So, again, it's an imagined space, but we see just people, again, painting her life. She's lounging there, and amongst these well-dressed, very sophisticated young ladies. And again, Stettheimer is conveying the image she wants all of us to think of who she is. Fashionable, attractive, very, very social. And it's a family portrait.
And that's Stella. Stella Wagner is the older sister who is depicted there at the left. And then, of course, along with Rosetta, the mother up at the top, always dressed in black. And then the three daughters. Asbury Park.
Well, this is incredibly, again...
Asbury Park South.
Asbury Park South. This is an important painting for many, many reasons. And in talking about this with Zahn and Nancy, we look at this canvas, and again, Florine is depicting the world around her. And she was very concerned that African Americans were not being treated or celebrated in the manner in which they should. And that's what this painting really is depicting. And because of her friendship with Carl Van Vechten, that is even brought more to the fore. And he is in the painting, sort of sitting in the box up on the left, top left there. You see this wonderful beach painting. There's a great deal of activity. She paints this as an awareness. Now, we talked about this painting, and it ended up going to the
Fisk
University, who recently deaccessioned it, and it came through a dealer in New York and was sold actually to someone else. But seldom do Stettheimer paintings come to light just because of the nature in which they went to museums and how they were acquired. You know, it's often said Stettheimer didn't show. She did. She exhibited in 2016. That was her first show. It was not the greatest success. We see a stylistic change after that. She does exhibit. She exhibits in the Whitney Biennale. She's with the Independent Artists.
Carnegie.
So again, she's part of the American art, the New York art community. Independent artists, you know, the first president was Glackens, and then Sloan is until his death. So here she is with people she knows, she's participating. So she's very much making, you know, references to what she feels is important. And this was a great painting, but the fact is that many of her paintings, you know, when her memorial exhibition is held in 46 at the MoMA, about a third of the paintings are in private hands by that time. The majority still stay with Stettheimer, and it's later that her sister disseminates these works.
Yes, and that's how most of all the Stettheimer paintings that are in public collections have ended up there. This particular painting, Asbury Park South, I think it's interesting. It was a special beach for African Americans. It's considered to be the first depiction of African Americans at leisure. I think it's also very interesting that Florine chose to paint this scene because this was also a time when the Jewish community was marginalized.
Yes.
There were towns from Elberon to Long Branch and Seabright on the New Jersey shore, and it was referred to as the Jewish Newport. And it was a similar thing with resorts in upstate New York, where they were really very, very
They were exclusionary
marginalized.
practices.
And the Stettheimers would go down and get an old cottage down in Monmouth Beach and go down there. And it was on one of the many trips where they were down there, and Van Vechten and a lot of his friends would come and visit. In the center of foreground is Duchamp and Fanny Marinoff, Van Vechten's wife. You see the flappers there on the left. On the back right is Avery Hopwood, again, the playwright. He's talking to an African-American woman. So very much depicting, the sort of lively, wonderful, leisurely quality, but of the African-American community.
When you think about Stettheimer and how she paints, but also the idea of who she's entertaining, how her life is, the famous character of Mame Dennis really is very reflective from a dramatic standpoint of who Stettheimer was.
And speaking of who Stettheimer was, and the environment she created.
This is an extremely important part that I don't think, and Nancy and I have talked about this at length, Zahn and I have talked about it, that people really focus on with Stettheimer. Now, she has 2 studios, but after her mother dies,
35.
she doesn't move with her sisters, but moves out to the Beaux-Arts
It's actually Bryant
Park Studios.
Everyone for years in all the books call it the Beaux-Arts Studio. It's still in existence. It's right on Bryant Park on 6th Avenue and 40th Street. It's the Bryant Park Studios.
And Zahn has cleared this up for us, actually. Well, she takes a studio there, and this is where she creates her world. Now, this is a woman now in her 60s. Please keep this in mind. This is not, a 25-year-old. And she takes this studio, and in it, and we're going to go through a few other images of it momentarily, she drapes pink cellophane drapes. Before we leave this on, we should talk about the fact that this is one of the Julie photographs. In this photograph, we see key major works by Stettheimer that never leave, that today are all in museums. And is it this image, or is it the next one that we can see some of her decorative?
We see the screens, we see
the
one of the cathedral paintings. The windows up across the top are her bedroom, which you'll see later. And then these are the cellophane curtains. She was enchanted with cellophane as material. Anything that sparkled and glittered, she loved. She had beaded gold fringy tassels. Let me just show another room here. There you go. This is a better view.
This is sort of her dining area, if you would. Now, we have to think about Max Cuny at this point, who is repurposing furniture as well as designing furniture and then painting it, as well as doing the same with frames.
And you can see that in the sideboard here, where it's...
But so is Florine Stettheimer, and as Zahn just pointed out, she's painting the sideboards. She is now creating an environment. So she's making an earthly residence, if you would, that she depicts in her paintings. These pinks, these beautiful white and gilded elements, so that it's very shimmery and pretty. Again, very different than the outside world. She is creating her own world. And I think that's really important when we now see how she's conveyed for really 20 years in painting. She's now realizing it in this new studio.
And I've just advanced to the next image where you see the gold and white table and the furniture.
We don't have a pointer, but I will get up and show you some things because this is extremely important. If you look, this is a table she designed. It has this heavy fringe, these the drapery elements. This is all carved in wood. It is not a cloth. You'll see the same decoration on the legs of the settee and this element. So, the skirt on the settee. And of course, here are the pink cellophane curtains. Well, again, she's created this wonderful parlor, if you would, that is where she wants to be seen, how she wants to entertain, the environment she's created. But she's had this furniture commissioned, and which goes next to it with, I think the next image, San, isn't that?
Well, no, these
No,
are
sir.
the three frames. Where,
Yes.
Actually, we could back up. You can see, and you'll see again in my presentation, just on the far left over the mantle is a bit of a beauty contest to the memory of P.T. Barnum, and you'll see a good image of that in my talk as well. But that is very much related. So there are certain frames that actually relate to her furniture design. So, and again,
That incorporate the same sort of white elements and this gold fringe. So now, this is sort of her signature for her, lack of better term, her parlor, where she entertains. And I think it's fantastic that at this moment, which did cause a little rift in the family because she wasn't staying with the sister, she went off, she creates.
She wanted her own home. Yeah.
She created her own home, but she also, it is reflective of the environments that she paints. And so when we think about Stettheimer, she really is creating environments. And she is taking us to a space, something that's beyond the norm. So what we have is that her work does take on a decorative note. It is there to take us somewhere else, to make a more interesting world for us to look at, something that's prettier than what we see on the streets. And now she's created that within this space.
Very much three-dimensional
Absolutely.
or multi-dimensional artist, really, where she was not a decorative artist. I mean, there was, it was so much larger than that. These are the three frames. She designed many, which you'll learn about shortly, but these are the only three frames where the frame design actually speaks specifically to the image. In other words, there's a relationship between the two.
And there are very few artists who ever do this. So again, I think this speaks to Stettheimer's desire to create environments and envelop her viewers in something that she is doing. It's like that old line about John Ford. If God had the money, he would have made the planet look the way John Ford does in his movies. And I think Stettheimer's doing that. She is improving the environmental surroundings. We see this in these frames, from New York or Liberty up in the upper left, and then down to the Duchamp painting, where these are reflective of what's going on in the canvas, and also are meant to tie into the environment around in the same way that we would see someone like Whistler doing this, or Dewing, who were famous for creating interiors, or even Tiffany.
Yeah, integrated environments.
The art's integrated into the environment, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I love is in the center picture, where it's a depiction of the beauty contest, but it's to the memory of P.T. Barnum. So it's, obviously making a point about the pageantry and the spectacle of it. And what does she do? But she creates a frame, a white and gold frame, which is literally the drapery and the tassels you'd see on the curtains of a theater. Family portrait.
The family portrait, the second family portrait. Now, throughout her career, she does these floral paintings, and she begins to use the flowers as a symbol for her. And we see these very, very large flowers that are Redon-like. She's being compared to that. Though I don't know that she really knew, was influenced by Redon, but you have these wonderful large flowers, and this portrait shows you sort of what she considered her masterpiece, her greatest work. You see the breadth that she's gone, that she's traveled, and that's very clear coming up.
Touchy or unresponsive? Nothing in between. Okay. Point, counterpoint.
And here we see what has happened in these 20 years that she's been, where she departed from her 1916 portrait of the family to this last portrait.
In the 30s.
In the 30s, mid-30s. And it's, I think the last time she paints her mother as well, is it not, Zahn, I think?
I'm not sure.
I believe it is. In any case, again, we see her life. She's painting it around. But now, the way she's identified the various members of her family, almost as if they're symbols. So here she is as a modernist who's doing something. She's progressed terribly in a different, gone in a different direction, much like we saw with Stuart Davis, certainly, leaving this older, more traditional style. Now she has these caricatures, if you would, of the various members of her family. But if you look carefully, the way they're painted, they're actually as young, if not younger, than the 1916 painting.
And these beautiful idealized flowers that are, really symbolic and referencing each of the sitters. Speaking of her multifaceted creative expression, the opera, Four Saints and Three Acts.
And here she does the set designs and costumes. If you look at the background, again, we see these huge cellophane drapes. Cellophane was really a relatively new product. It had only been developed in 1900 and became somewhat commercial in France by 12. And then in the 20s, DuPont's making it here. And it actually accounts for, in the late 20s, a huge portion of their overall, of DuPont's overall sales. But look at the background, those huge, shiny, transparent cellophane drapes. I mean, she was just in love with this material because, it creates that magnificent artificial environment. But something I also find very interesting is she really employs an element, and we see it on the left, the little box with the canopy. She employs an element that she used in her 1930 painting, The Love Flight of the Pink Candy Heart, where she is set in a very similar environment. It's a fanciful, beautiful stage set, and you can only imagine just how very different it had to be for contemporary audiences to see this.
Gold and white.
Yes.
That sort of gold and white furniture theme again, too.
Absolutely.
This premiered in 1934 at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, thanks in large part to Everett Chick Austin, who was really quite the visionary. And it was hugely successful, and then went on and played in Broadway. She designed not only the sets, but the costumes as well. And many people say that it's ironic that at this point in her life, where she's in her 60s, this is the sort of first huge, large, very public success. She was, even though she would have her salons and her parties to show all of her paintings for her friends, she really never had like a one single show, after the Knoedler show in 16. So this was a really very public triumph for Florine.
And again, I think it underscores how she's really interested in creating environments, and we can't lose sight of that with her canvases.
Yes, thank you. Gertrude Stein wrote the libretto for the opera.
Bless you.
Excuse me. The music was done by the composer Virgil Thomson. It was when Virgil Thomson saw Florine's paintings and met her that he thought she would be a perfect choice for the sets and costumes. And this was back in 28, 29. She was very excited about it and interested in it, made maquettes and all sorts of things in preparation and for the show. Thank you so much, Roberta, for reminding us to mention that was a really important part of the story, that this was written by Gertrude Stein, although there is a pretty amusing quote that at one point someone asked Florine about the meaning of the content. She said, I have no idea. So, which leads us to the cathedral paintings.
And, as we look at the cathedrals, which span 1929 to 42, we are reminded that Florine is a woman of her time. She is someone who enjoys all the wonder New York has to offer, and she celebrates it with these cathedral paintings. They're slightly out of order. They're hanging at the Met, and Zahn and I would encourage everyone to go see them.
They're large. They're 50 by 40 50 inches tall. And they're remarkable. I'll just tell you across the left. From the left is Cathedral of Art, then it's the Cathedrals of Wall Street, Cathedrals of Broadway, and on the right is Cathedral of Fifth Avenue. And as Jim said, it's a question why they chose to hang them in this order. They're all the same size. Cathedrals of Broadway was the first painting, the one with the very orangey red background, and then Cathedrals of Fifth Avenue came next. Third was Cathedrals of Wall Street in 39, and then the Cathedral of Art.
And you can see that there's a palette change in the cathedrals, that the earliest one, the one in 29, the Cathedrals of Broadway, which is also sort of an evening image, was in the is one end, but then you go to the Cathedral of Fifth Avenue, and this is very interesting because here she arrives in a limousine, and as she's getting out of it with her sisters to go shopping somewhere on Fifth Avenue, and she references all these various stores that Bendel's and that she would frequent. But the grill, she has her monogram on the grill of the car. So she's about automotive design. I mean, this is a woman who wants her mark all over her life. And she really wants to create her persona and her image, and this is how we are to remember her. So we see that in the Cathedrals of Fifth Avenue. There are all sorts of references in the Cathedral of Wall Street, but it's the Cathedral of Art that we really have to see here.
Cathedral of Art.
Now, they're all humorous, but this is the most humorous. This is
wonderful satire of the art world of New York.
There really is. Because she's talking about modern art, and she's not necessarily talking about it in the best light. And so I think it probably is going to be best if I go up, and Suzanne's going to, we'll talk about the various characters, but I'm going to point to them because you really have to dissect this painting. Because it is the art world, and it is the art world, quite honestly, that we have inherited. So we see Stettheimer, who is in, by the way, all four of the canvases. She's often including herself in her portraits, and as if she's a Renaissance artist, so to speak. But here she is, in a very prominent pavilion in the entire sort of American art world. And this is Florine, red hair, very attractive. Notice she's holding the flowers that are a symbol of her, that she uses as her symbol. But take a look at her pavilion. It is white drapes with gold fringe. And where does that go back to? But the furniture, and Zanen was pointing this out as when we were talking about this. It goes right back to her environment. The environment she created in her studio, she has now painted herself as a member of the art community in that environment, sitting there. The same white and gold fringe that is her parlor is her pavilion in the Cathedral of Art.
And just to her right is Henry McBride. And the baby, the infant, is this new art that they're welcoming. That's George Platt Lynes is photographing the baby there in the foreground.
And the new art is, she characterizes it as this infant, as if it is, the baby New Year that's arriving. And we're going to see the little baby all throughout. Of course, we see the aging Stieglitz. Stieglitz ages. She doesn't, by the way, in his dramatic cape. And across from her, Stieglitz is one of the curators.
Marie Sterner.
Who is holding
a Nodelman bust. Behind her is Monroe Wheeler. Also on the left of the arch is Kirk Askew with the folded arms. Behind him with his arm raised up is Pavel Chelychev. I would also mention across from Florine on the left is a man named Robert Locker, who also known as Bobby Locker. He was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a good friend of Charles Demuth. and a very successful interior designer, one of these many people that have been lost to memory, although he's been recently written about.
And it's interesting how Florine paints these young guys that she finds interesting, that she wants as part of her circle. Very attractive young men, yet her friend Henry McBride, well, like Stieglitz, he ages. So it kind of gives you an idea of Florine's idea of youth and beauty, so to speak.
And then, of course, she was referencing the three major institutions. On the left is the Museum of Modern Art, the center is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and on the right is the Whitney.
And this is where Florine allows us to get a glimpse of the way she's thinking of these individuals. And it is an amusing situation, because here we have Alfred Barr, who is just captivated by this little baby, the new art, performing. Here we have the director of the Metropolitan Museum, who is escorting the new art into the museum. However, we have a little something going on over here. Zahn, you want to
The curator. On the left is the director of the Met, Francis Henry Taylor, and on the right is the curator, whose name I don't have.
Who's the curator of paintings at the Met.
Who said that he only liked paintings with beautiful young women in them. So it's him, it's the curator standing there with a beautiful young thing.
And Stettheimer includes this element of this young lady, this blonde on a pedestal, in a direct reference to the director of the Met and the curator of paintings, and their appreciation of, they look at attractive women in fashion as in a cocktail dress. And then
Juliana Force.
Over here, we have Juliana Force, very sternly looking, and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney is represented by this sculpture. And as that is the only piece in the museum at that time, and of course the iconic Whitney Eagle is up there. It's interesting that when you look at, and this is another talk at some point, that when you look at Florine Stettheimer and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, they are literally contemporaries. They were born within a year of each other, and they died within a year of each other. They both had these studio parties, these environments. Of course, Whitney goes on to do something much larger, but they were two women doing very similar things at the same time and sort of interact. We don't know what their interaction was, and I think that would be it would be wonderful for someone to dig into that whole story.
Suffice it to say, so many avenues to explore, especially as it pertains to Florine.
Yes.
And I'm looking forward to exploring one of them with you in just a minute. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
So both of you have looked at her paintings very closely, especially the frames. Have you looked at her technique in applying pigment? Have you worked with conservators, and do you have some knowledge of her technique? Because the only two people she would allow to watch her paint were Duchamp and Henry McBride. Only McBride writes two sentences, that she put on zinc white like sculpture and covered it with the veils like her pink. But that isn't what actually happens. So have you looked into exactly how she painted and created these paintings?
I have looked at the paintings very closely. I've not had the privilege of looking at them with the conservator, although I'm looking at one right now that I may drag to do this now that you bring it up. She's painting in a fairly conventional method, but what she's doing in several of the canvases, and we notice this in the cathedrals, it's very prevalent, she's also playing around with a lot of impasto and building it up, and you're getting this sort of relief thing going on. But she only does that from what we were able to discern with gilded elements. That's what she tends to progress. The other ones, she's not using that same amount of impasto to really build it up into a relief situation. She's painting thickly. I can speak to Love Flight of the Pink Candy Heart. It is fragile as can be. Her works are not necessarily as stable as we may want them. They are fragile. There are flaking problems. There are delaminating problems galore. So from a technical standpoint, I don't know about, I don't know what she did and why they are not holding up as well as they should. She does put an enormous amount of paint on.
Yeah.
And I think the comment about, lathering the lead white on and using that as an underground for the other painting, I think that's how she gets some of these very vibrant colors. That next element I can't really speak to, but she paints thickly, as she paints wet into wet, and she does do a lot of relief work.
I can speak further to your question too. Her paintings are notoriously fragile, apparently, and it does have a lot to do with her working method and this profound buildup of the white that she liked to use. I'm happy to say that Roberto Ferrari, who is here today, who is with the art division of the Avery Architectural Library at Columbia University, where a great amount of the Florine Stettheimer paintings and even papers in the Butler Rare Manuscript Library reside, is very interested in looking into actually pursuing an analysis of her painting methods, having them examined, because it is a problem apparently across the board. All of her canvases seem to suffer, for lack of a better word, from her working methods. So I think this is something important that we have to look forward to in the coming years. Absolutely. Yes, indeed.
She was painting on a fine linen canvas. It wasn't a coarse canvas. And there is, as Zan mentioned, a certain weightiness to the pigment. And then you have where there are the gilded elements, you have the additional weight of it being built up. So, it's not surprising that they're this fragile, but they are terribly fragile.
Yes.
You referenced the DIA and that the curator went in storage, and she had the 18th century was revered there, and that in so many museums across the country, they had the Florine Stettheimer paintings, but they were in storage. So I'm imagining that for the early people of the 18th century, they probably looked at these as very decorative because of the brilliant colors and illustrative. So was it curators or was it art historians that shifted and pulled them out, and she has the stature
it's
that she has
curators
now?
that put them on the walls of museums. Art historians probably talked about it later. Stettheimer was never completely forgotten. There are exhibitions that happen, but when we think about American art pre-1976, when there's really the bicentennial and this great interest in American art and the rediscovery of things like the Hudson River School, and then later to look at American Impressionism. If you read someone like Edgar Richardson, or even to a certain extent Lloyd Goodrich, they develop a canon that's very different than it is today. And so when they were looking at someone like Stettheimer, they're looking at the same way that they are at Sargent, that they didn't feel that this was what they were defining as American art. So these people are relegated to storage. When I started at the DIA, the associates of the American wing did not want to think about furniture after 1820, and really 1810 was, that Ampere gilded stuff wasn't so great. This was what American art was. It's that very colonial revival mentality. But looking at Richardson, he'll give a nod to certain people. He did not care for Cassatt. He doesn't care for Sargent. He barely touches on people like Sloane or Henry. Yet there are artists that he truly feels are great. And what's interesting is some of the artists that he focuses on are very out of vogue today. And, people say, it's that American genre painting. Why do we want to look at it? Which is a good sort of sign to all of us that, well, if Richardson found it interesting, we should look at that, but we should also look at this other material. So it is curators that when we're beginning to look at who was doing what when in American art, that you begin to bring out people who were significant. Stettheimer's significant not because she was a teacher and not because she showed a great deal, but because of the environments she created and who she was part of, and she's a damn interesting painter. I mean, she's painting unlike any other American in the same way you may look at Pen Dubois. He's not painting like anyone else, but gosh, he does some very interesting things, and I think you could say the same thing about Florian Stettheimer.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I want to mention the artist Wood Gayler. I don't know whether anyone in this room is familiar with Wood Gayler. He's working in a manner very similar to Stettheimer. He was the president of the Salons of America, and he also worked with Walt Kuhn on the Penguin Club, which I published an article on several years ago that was uber modernist. And the Baker Pisano collection at the Heckscher includes a party at Kenneth Hayes Miller's studio. So his manner is quite different from Stettheimer, and he doesn't have her brilliance in making frames, for instance. But he is coming back to light, and there will be a show at the University of Vermont with a catalog. And his pictures really, the ones that I'm familiar with, chronicle specific events that happened, like these wild Greenwich Village parties, costume parties, Walt Kuhn's scripted theatrical plays, et cetera, et cetera. So they form an interesting juxtaposition, if you will.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Well,
And the other, I have a question, and maybe you'll be addressing this, Suzanne. What happened to Stettheimer's furniture?
Well, that's a good question. We really don't know. Some of it is at Columbia.
Well, here's what we understand. Jim talked about what was happening in the early 70s. In 1995, Barbara Blamink, first as her dissertation for Yale, and then published the book, The Art and Life of Florine Stettheimer. And it's an extraordinary book, very well researched. It goes into great detail all about her life, her work, her paintings. It's really a fabulous resource, and it's on my bibliography. The understanding is that there may be a few pieces of furniture that are with Stettheimer descendants out in California. I would love to go find them. But what Barbara said at the time of her book, and that's been sort of carried forward, is that a number of the pieces of the furniture were donated, as were many other things, to Columbia, but these went to the theater department, and that they were painted over and long since discarded. To me, 95, or not 95, even 65 and 75 is not ancient history, but perhaps at Columbia it is, meaning when you're a young person, time is
We
relative.
do know where two pieces are. They're photographed. It's the screen that was in the
fair enough, the screens,
the
yeah.
photograph that was in the standing sort of folding screen, and then the fire screen. Those we still know those exist, but in the same way, and thinking of the Baker Pisano collection, that Walt Kuhn was dismissed, or Max Cuny rather was dismissed, and his furniture ignored and not really prized. That's changing now, but you have to think about how much was just really had to have been discarded over the years because of lack of appreciation. It is the old story that is not where we are today with frames for paintings, how in that period, that post-World War II period of modernism, where we're looking at the international style, where we want clean, sleek rooms, all of this gilding, any of this fancy stuff is decadent. It's, they want to discard it. Tiffany is discarded. So it is sort of a standard thing that's happened. Great buildings built in the 20s are compromised and modernized because, it's just gaudy. We now, fortunately, I hope, have a little more of an enlightened approach when we think about these things. But I think that Stettheimer's, a lot of her furniture probably became a victim of, that this was just, not something that was that significant. And that's sad because it really was the environment was decorated by her, created by her. It was a realization of what she painted. Yes. That one, yeah.
Well, here, actually,
This is the one I'm interested in.
oh, okay, because there's not a screen in this image.
What is in the center of that table? Is it silver?
It's a vase, it's a silvery mirrored vase, and then she actually made flowers that are beaded. They're like beaded flowers.
It's probably mercury glass.
Do we know what become of that?
And then if we could just go back one more, I'll see if this will work now, maybe. Oh, thanks, Elle. Yeah, you can see actually the two screens on
You
the
want me to
left.
point 'em out,
There's-
Zan?
One is the fire screen, and then the tall screen, which is at MoMA right now, and also has condition issues.
There's the fire screen, and then here is the folding screen, and I dare say it's because of the lead white issue.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do see one more question, but I'll
Okay.
take your question, but we need to keep moving too. Your question, Mark?
I have a question as to where the salons took place. From what I know, the Aaronsbergs were having their salon with Duchamp around the same time, and would like to hear something about the overlap between the two salons, where they happened, in what location. for the
I'll be
salons.
addressing that momentarily.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Well, thank you.